Hey guys, I am waiting for my co host, whatever she is, tonight, Ariella. I'm waiting for her to sign on. Tonight, I am going to be talking with Ariella about back, re entering our life post pandemic. I'm just waiting for Ariella to request to join. Okay, she's joining now. Um, Hey,
Hi.
how are you?
That worked. Okay. How are
Yes,
you, Rachel?
good. Okay, Ariella, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but tonight we are going to be talking about re-entering the world post-pandemic. So it looks like we're getting to that point really where life is kind of resuming. And I know in some communities, some like schools and schools are starting to have different masking policies. And things are really starting, people are starting to go back into the office. There's a lot that's happening. And in some ways it's so exciting and hopeful, and in other ways it's like very scary and overwhelming. And so we were discussing how we really want to like validate that experience and those feelings and give people just some like support and tips on how to really take care of themselves in a time that's really like vulnerable and it can feel scary. So Ariella, just for the people that are new to you and haven't followed you or don't know who you are, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us who you work with, a little bit about yourself.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. First of all, I'm so excited to be here with you, Rachel. I am like a huge fan of yours from afar, and I'm so glad we've connected. And this is such an important topic that I think there's like murmurs of conversation. And
Yeah.
Rachel does such a good job of taking like murmurs and making it kind of like, let's talk about it. Like, let's no longer let this be kind of small side conversation. So I'm really looking forward to talking about the unspoken. Like, let's really bring it to the forefront. So my name is Ariella. I am a clinical social worker in Manhattan, currently working remotely, teletherapy, all about the Zoom sessions. I specialize in anxiety and depression with young professionals, and I have a unique focus on self-acceptance and mindfulness, and just really kind of looking at our whole human experience, working through relationships, working through self-doubt, through a lens of self-acceptance and compassion, while also kind of looking at the thoughts that we feed ourselves, the narratives that we fuel our brains, and how to be really present through mindfulness and through compassion of self, of really, really coming to a place of understanding why we function in the way we do, why we think the way we do. Um, and yes, I am so happy to be here tonight with you. That's a little bit about me. And I think also what's so great about Instagram, Rachel, tell me if you agree, is that you get a sense from people's, therapists now on Instagram. It's such an incredible platform. You get a real sense of somebody's style and personality and thoughts through their posts. So I
Yeah,
think it's a nice way.
yeah, it's great. I feel like I always say, like, Instagram is like the best way to kind of like, if you're looking for a therapist, it's the best way to kind of make that like shidduch, find that match, because you really get to see how a therapist, like what their approach is, how they're thinking, what their mentality, and really kind of cut out a lot of like time and even heartache in trying to figure out, like
Yes.
who is best for you. Um,
It's really an ideal
so I
way
guess,
to shop for a therapist. Like I used to tell clients, go in Psychology Today, put in your insurance, what you're looking for. But now it's like, go on Instagram, like see if their style vibes with what you're looking for and their expertise. And do you want to listen to what they have to say? Anyway,
yeah.
this isn't a
And we
talk about how to find a therapist, but
That'll be our next one. Our next
yeah.
one. I have so much to say on that. So something that we spoke about beforehand, like while we were kind of figuring out what points we wanted to talk about, because there is so much to talk about, is we wanted to talk about some of the, again, like re-entering the world post-pandemic, and really just starting with like maybe some of the lingering physical and mental symptoms that people might have, like going back, when you get that phone call or that email, like, hey, we're so excited, we want to start bringing people back into the office, or, shul is open and we're going to have, instead of 6 feet, 3 feet and unmasked while you're sitting in the shul, or hey, my wedding invitation, someone's wedding invitation just showed up in the mail and it's like the first thing that you're going to, or a weekend bar mitzvah or whatever it is, where like you really haven't gone anywhere for over a year. And like what that can do, when you first get that glimpse of like, shoot, like, oh my God, I really have to start doing this. And even when you're in that situation, some of the symptoms that you might be feeling. Uh,
Yes.
so go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think it's so important. I think, first of all, when I was thinking about our talk today, I think that the first thing that we need to remind ourselves is that the busy mind, right? We all have these busy minds, especially living in New York City. I don't know, those of you that, or the five towns, right? Wherever you are in life, there's chaos. And that just kind of like conditions our mind, our busy mind, to run to the future. So when we're now faced with all of these new opportunities, exactly what you're saying, Rachel, whether it's synagogue or if you're logging on and you go to a different, church or whatever it is, there's a lot of firsts coming up for people. And I think the place that we really have to start is that we have to understand that when there's this ongoing uncertainty, it does take a toll on our mental health,
Yeah.
right? Our brains have been wired. If we take a step back and we think about for more than a year now what we've been through, we've been secluded at home, right? We've been kind of trying to stay safe and protected in our homes and our apartments with people that feel safe for us. And all of a sudden, there's all this talk about reemerging, as you said, wedding invitations, or work wants you to come back in person. And I think we just have to validate that it's only normal that it will take a second for everybody to adjust, because
Yeah.
our brains, like if you look at the neuroscience, our brains have really been wired for protection, right? When there's this kind of like ongoing uncertainty that is a traumatic stressor in a sense, because we've been wired to protect kind of in survival mode.
Yeah. 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 And I think then that, like you were saying, like we start adapting, right? And our brains are wired to help us kind of get used to things, which is like a wonderful blessing. But then at the same time, now we have to get unused to that and we have to get back to normal. And I think a lot of us, I know I've heard this a lot, I'm sure you have also, like people feel like I don't know how to socialize anymore. I have some anxiety. Like I've never had that before. And I'm like terrified. I feel like I don't know how to talk to people. And we know that this is valid, not just because people are expressing it so it's valid, but like there's been articles in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, like this is a thing that people are like, I'm socially awkward now. Like I haven't spoken to anyone except my husband, kids, myself, like nobody. It's either been through Zoom. I haven't had face-to-face interactions with people in over a year. It feels weird for me. I feel like I don't know how to do it anymore. It feels exhausting for me, right? And that's something that we want to like validate, and we want to say like it makes sense that you're going to feel that way, because we know that so much also of our behavior is built on like practice and habits, and exposure. So when we've not been given those opportunities for so long, it's going to feel funny to get back into it and try to just be like, back to ourselves. So even if you were someone that was very social and had company all the time or went out to people or, were always doing these things and then you didn't, it will feel uncomfortable
Yeah.
and awkward at first. You know?
There's a word that comes, sorry.
No, no, go
Oh,
ahead.
a word that comes to mind that I've been speaking about with a lot of clients and friends and family, just kind of the murmurs kind of in the air, is the word adjustment, right? Like think about a change that you've had in your life, right? Like going to college or moving, a different apartment or, getting a new job. There is an adjustment period that happens when there's a significant shift. And I think that we have to give ourselves some, first of all, compassion, which we'll talk about in a second, because I think that's the biggest piece here. But first of all, to really take a step back and understand there's going to be an adjustment period. I don't know, honestly, I don't know that it would be totally normal to just feel right back, at home, and to feel right back like, okay, this is comfortable. It takes a minute. I know for myself a few weeks ago, I went back to shul, to my synagogue, and it took a minute to kind of look around. And there's also, we want to touch on to talk about like people's own judgment and boundaries and what's comfortable, what's not. We'll check on that. I got a lot of questions about that, but taking a minute for yourself of just acknowledging that this is an adjustment, because I think our anxious mind runs to, oh my God, I have no social skills. Oh my God, I'm socially awkward. Like, I don't know how to talk to that person. But we have to take a step back and remember it will all be okay. It will all work out. It's like riding a bike, right? You have social skills. It just takes a minute. It's like, when you have friends that you haven't seen in a while, right? That's like all of us. And then you suddenly see them in person. It's only normal that it takes a few minutes to warm up. It doesn't mean you're no longer friends. It doesn't mean you don't have social skills. It just means it's been a bit, and it takes time in person to adjust.
Yeah. I think even just the simple act of like taking off your mask in situations where you had to wear it for so long, that can feel so strange for people. Like, wait, I don't have to wear my mask at my desk. I don't have to wear my mask in shul. And for people, it feels kind of scary. So there are some people who are like not ready to do that. They're like, I still want to be masked, even if they're fully vaccinated and it's fine and they're in a setting wherever, and again, I think like we also, not just having compassion for ourselves, we need to have compassion for other people and not judge and not be like, you're crazy. What's the point of getting vaccinated if you're going to still wear your mask? People need time to adjust. They need space to kind of like get back into that into that headspace of like, okay, like this is what we're doing now. This has really been like a protective, literally a survival mode that people have been in. And for some people, they can't wait to rip that mask off and they're like, all right. But for other people, it does take time. And I think we need to honor that. And I think we need to save our judgments and we need to just be compassionate to people and not judge. And that's why I think I've seen a lot of communities really doing it in like baby steps, taking, small steps. Okay, we're going to start, with one area. We're going to, we're going to do things a little bit more, relaxed, and then eventually start spreading and whatever. And I think that kind of scaffolding is like a very good technique. I think that's something we should use in our lives whenever we're starting to do something difficult or scary. Really not just like throw ourselves into it. And sometimes we hear that exposure therapy, people
Just
think
going
you
to say that.
the band-aid, right? But we can use a scaffolding kind of like measure technique to say, okay, like bit by bit, we're going to do it. Exposure therapy is not just throw the dog on their lap. It's show them, say the word dog, show them a picture of a dog, watch a video of a dog,
Yeah.
go outside and look at a dog across the street, right? Like we really take it slow. And I think that that's like a wonderful method of like saying to yourself when things are hard, like, yes, I should try to get comfortable with it, but it doesn't have to be like all or nothing.
Yes. I think a really big part also in being compassionate with others, I think that we have to amp up our communication more than ever, right? So when you're at work and let's be honest, I'm going to channel my Rachel Tuckman and just say what people aren't talking about, right? We're all kind of following the CDC, right? We're trying to follow what feels like we're grounding ourselves with the knowledge we have, but a part of it is also we're kind of making it up as we go, right? What feels comfortable? If you're outside, if there's a crowd, what does a crowd mean, right? Like 2 people, 4 people, 10 people, it's so confusing. And I think that the key point in trying to re-enter the world is really to use our communication. So what that looks like, for example, is if you're at work and it's you and another vaccinated adult, in a room, checking in. Is it okay if I take my mask off? Would you prefer for me to keep it on? Really checking in with the other person. I think that's a social skill I've been noticing. Like I've kind of amped up of, okay, fine, maybe I am comfortable with taking it off and I'm vaccinated, but really checking in, even if you're walking with a friend and just saying to them, is this comfortable for you? Like, I'm totally can keep it on. What is okay? Checking in with the other person, because that's showing that you're not just going to do what feels right for you, because this is a very sensitive, very vulnerable topic. I mean, I think we should also mention there's been so much loss, right? Like collective trauma and collective loss, and people have had different associations with COVID. People have had family members that just lost their smell and got it back, right? People have family members that are still struggling and still have trouble breathing, and people have lost people, right? People have passed away. So we don't know their association, especially with coworkers at work, or especially I see somebody wrote an engagement party or a wedding or synagogue, wherever you are, we don't know what that person's experience through COVID has been. So checking in with them and saying what's comfortable for you, I think is crucial.
Yeah, that's great. And that can lead us into our next topic about just setting boundaries, right? Honoring other people's boundaries by checking in with them and asking what they're comfortable with. And again, like without judgment, not being like, oh my God, she's crazy. She's double vaxxed for a month already. Like, this is what this person needs. But then even thinking for yourself, like, what are the boundaries that you want to set? And what are the things that you're comfortable with? And that doesn't just mean in terms of masking or social things. It also means just like getting to know yourself, that new you, right? Allowing yourself back into the world. Like, what does that mean? How does that work? What do you want to allow yourself to do, and what do you want to allow in terms of your socializing and in terms of your again, like kind of getting to know who you become, and we're not the same people, right? I think that's important to pay attention to also.
That's a huge piece, and I want to kind of it's twofold. One is boundaries with others, and one is getting to know yourself. So I think when we talk about, and that those were a few of the questions, I don't know the questions you got in, but a question that came up a few times was, how do I set boundaries with friends? I keep getting these invites. I keep getting these calls, to come for a Shabbat meal or to go for drinks or dinner with a friend, or, what is right for me? And I think before even setting a boundary, I think that first we need to define what feels right, right? And even if you define it as I'm not totally sure right now, right? I think some of us are in this exploring stage of I don't know what feels right. I have to kind of step in. It's kind of like dating in a sense, right? Like you kind of have to step into dating, and that's how you get the most information about yourself, what triggers me, what works for me, what totally doesn't work for me. And I think sometimes we have to step into experiencing ourselves in these different ways to say, okay, I don't want to do that again, that was way too close, or that was way too risky, or okay, wait, that actually felt okay, I think I'm okay with that. And really saying to friends, my truth is that I'm not sure what feels right.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest piece is that communication, that openness, that honesty, and checking in with yourself. Also understanding that in some situations you might feel, like, hey, yeah, I am pretty social. Like my skills are all right. And then in other situations you're gonna be like, oh, please, like, oh my God, like what is wrong with me? Again, that's I think where that self-compassion comes in. Like it's every situation is gonna feel different and new, and you kind of have to find your footing. And I think that's important to just like no judgment on yourself, on others, and just kind of like figure it out as you go. And I think that, like we were saying, like it's just a matter of like practice and getting back into habits and getting comfortable again. And things will eventually find like where they're supposed to be. It could be that a part of you has realized or has have become more comfortable with like, what, I like a more low key social life. Like, it is, I see that it is a little bit stressful for me, and I think I'm going to stick with this. And
That
that's
is
okay.
so important. That is so important. But before we even go there, I think something important, I was just speaking about this with a client earlier tonight, is that when you're in a social event, right? When you've decided, okay, I'm going to go to this engagement party, I'm going to go to this wedding, whatever it is, it's so important to bring your busy mind to the present moment. So literally the mindfulness technique in that moment is like if you're drinking something, it's like, oh, this LaCroix tastes really good, right? Or I'm speaking to someone and it's noticing, oh, I like her shirt, or I like, what I like what he's saying. Whatever it is to stay so present in the moment, because truth is that over time, the overreactive brain really can be grounded in staying present. So when we're in a social event, it's about really holding ourselves back from jumping to, I have no social skills and how am I going to do this? And it's really that self-compassion. I love what you said, Rachel, of even like kind of talking to yourself after and saying like, okay, I did well. Like I still got this, right? Like I'm not totally, I didn't lose all my skills. I still have my groove, right? But really checking in with yourself, both also to give yourself credit of, wait, I actually did that. Wasn't so bad. Like I'm okay. It just takes time. I think that's so important.
And patience, right? Patience with yourself. Like, it's going to feel comfortable at first in some situations. And I think, again, like when we're not patient with ourselves and we get angry at ourselves, like, what the heck is wrong with me? I think then it just adds this pressure. And again, we know shame is like never helpful. And just acknowledging that even if let's say you didn't lose anyone, if you were lucky enough not to really lose anyone close to you, and you didn't feel so negatively affected by COVID, meaning like you had a job that you could work from home and financially you were okay. And like, yes, it was stressful, but overall, like you're okay. Sometimes people don't realize how much they were affected. And I actually saw an article, I think it was in the Times, I'm not sure, where it talked about like the power of like acquaintances, even like how we don't even realize that, like, let's say you go to synagogue or church, or or just like you take the train and you would see people in the morning and be like, oh hey, morning, and like that's it. Like even those acquaintances impact our mental health. And we even miss those little interactions. And in some ways, those are even more powerful. People think, well, I just have my core friends that I hang out with, my bubble, I'm fine, but they still felt this, let's say, languishing or this dormant unhappiness or whatever it was. And this article was saying that, yeah, there's all of these other social interactions that we have throughout the day that we're missing because we're isolated, because we're not going into the office, we're not taking the train, we're not doing whatever, and we're missing those little opportunities to make eye contact with someone and, hey, what's up, and whatever it is, from even across the room. So I think we kind of like don't realize how much in our lives impacts us and really does make us feel connected to people, even if it's, like I said, the mailman, have a great day, but you weren't
Yeah.
seeing him shoving the mail through the door and running away, it matters.
Well, I think
So,
sometimes even with anxiety work, we have to really ground ourselves with information. So when we go to this place of what's wrong with me, you remind yourself that we've been in a pandemic induced isolation, right? Like really reminding yourself, yeah, that's what's been going on, right? That's what's been going on. We've been told to isolate. So exactly what you're saying. It's like we've been kind of disconnected from the normal flow of our lives, and we've been isolated. So it's kind of like, of course it's going to take a minute to adjust.
yeah. And that brings our next point where you had brought this up, and I thought it was such a great point, where we've had like basically all this isolation, right, really affected milestones for a lot of people. And we're not just talking about kids, adults in their lives where, there were certain things that could have been happening that were really kind of put on hold, paused, prevented from having to, stay at home, be on lockdown, quarantine, whatever it is. So I want you to say more about that.
Yeah, I think it's important to bring up because I think that, the formative period. So I work with a lot of 20s and 30s-year-old and young professionals trying to really gain a sense and figure out themselves, right? The formative years is also a period of figuring it out, right? So kind of you've moved from the space of living with your parents or living with your family, you've emerged from college. It's like the emerging adult, right? And you're trying to figure out your own identity. And it's the years of trying to figure out what's important to me for me, right? Aside from how I grew up and aside from how, the messages that were sent to me in my childhood, what's important to me and really what do I want my life to look like? And I talk about this a lot is exploring, right? It's trying things out. It's going to internship. It's getting a really bad job and saying, okay, never want to do that, right? It's dating good guys, it's dating bad guys, girls too, right? It's it's
Yeah.
it's all about experiential learning. And it's kind of been on pause, right? In a sense that it's like, okay, all of that is a halt and you can only connect via, the phone and you can only connect via Zoom. And that's really challenging, especially for people starting out and again, trying to create that sense of identity in these formative years. So
Yeah.
I think even more so, it's about kind of for sure being compassionate with myself. My life has been on hold for a full year. My dating, my internship, my work, right? My whole flow, going out, experiencing myself has been on a hard pause.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
re-entering that will take a second. Yes.
Yeah. And I think we know there's grief in that, right? Lost opportunities, feeling like, a chunk of your life was like missing, right? I've seen people saying like this year doesn't count. I'm not really 28.
Yes.
Like I want to do over. And there's like validity to that. Like, yeah, we feel like a year of our lives have been like taken away from us. That there was so much. I know even for me, like I'm like 2021, how? Like what? Like when I'm trying to figure out like what year, even when I think about it, I'm like, wait, when did COVID start? 2019, 2020? I can't even remember. It's all just like a blur. So I think that that's something important for us to remember too. Like there's this chunk of time that we were really just like in survival mode, that we were like kind of on autopilot, like just get through each day, get through each day. We don't know what's coming, just get through each day. And I think in some ways we're still kind of like we don't really know what's
Mhm.
coming, which I think is life in general, but I think this is just like on steroids, right?
Yes.
Like we never have certainty and we never know what's coming. But I think when things are kind of uneventful, we're able to kind of just like, feel like we have control. And I think when there's crises like this, we realize like there's nothing that I can control. And so that feels very scary. So I think that um, just kind of like realizing that there's a grief in the time that was lost, that you hated doing Zoom dating, or that you had to like do these like socially distanced outside dates, or you started a new job and it like you haven't been able to make connections with coworkers because you were working from home and isolated. Like there's a lot of grief in that, and I think that's important to honor and talk about and notice and say that, if you're feeling kind of a disconnect in wherever you're at in certain situations, say, okay, it could be because of what I've just gone,
Yes.
and so I need to give myself time.
Yes, and I think a big part of what we need to realize, and this is, we're coming from a mental health perspective, but there's going to be lingering symptoms of COVID, right? Just like some people still don't have their smell, or some people still have, chest tightness, and it's so difficult. We're also going to have lingering symptoms mentally. And when we kind of acknowledge that, and I want to kind of shed light also into holding both, holding the difficult, and then how we're emerging from this is as different change people, I want to talk about a little bit. But first, really just creating space that this ongoing uncertainty does take a toll mentally. It does. That we're reemerging into a space that it's not totally post, right? I had somebody message me, it's not totally post, but
Yeah, no.
there's some light, there's some opening, right? New York City's opening July 1st. There's some direction of emerging from this, right? Although we're still stuck in different strains and there is still uncertainty, it's still important to name that there is a shift in the world. Just really noticing that, there are going to be lingering symptoms mentally. And in grief work, we say that, you don't really move on, you move with it, right? You don't just move on. You don't just move on from a loss. And I think that I want to use this term lightly, but I think that it has been, everybody has gone through some type of loss or trauma in this, right? The loss of your formative years, the loss of graduation, the loss of proper dating, whatever it is, all the things that we've mentioned, the loss of seeing clients in person. Like I miss that so much. Really getting to feel your client's energy in the room and nonverbal body language. There's just been a hard pause and a loss to our routine. But as we move with it, none of us are going to emerge the same, right? That there's no way we can. I tell my clients, like, there is no way that you could go through a global pandemic and just emerge into the world the same. For myself, I was just kind of thinking about, so I love exercise, and my life pre-pandemic was chaos. I would go to work and then go to Equinox and bring my gym bag and shower there and then go see a client. And then it was just like, I think about it now, Rachel, and I'm like, what was I thinking? Like, how is that a
Right.
way to live, right? It's like schlepping like bags and like just chaos. And it's so interesting because that was just how I went through life. That was like, oh yeah, of course, you're going here and then there, and like, where can we talk? It was just like, there was chaos. And now I feel COVID has really forced me to slow down. And that way of life, Equinox open now, and I'm thinking, do I want to work out in a mask? I want to go back. Like that way of life of the chaos is so not me anymore. It's so interesting.
And that's what I was saying earlier, how sometimes people now going back into the world, and let's say they're at, a function or whatever, and they're like, like I'm not doing well with this, like I don't like this. I think even that, like, don't put that pressure on yourself to be like, but I was Miss Social before. I gotta be like, no, maybe that isn't who you are anymore. Maybe you are a new person, and maybe you did enjoy that, but maybe now it's not for you. And like that's okay. We can change that. We don't have to go into those old patterns of, and this is what so many people were saying to me in the questions I was getting, like, but what if like you feel conflicted about like missing that life, but also like loving what it brought for you, and like you're kind of glad to like be able to achieve some kind of normal, but like you were being forced to slow down, to stop, to be with your family, to realize what was important to you, to scale back on your job, to take a minute, like I think people, that's kind of the mode we were in before all of this was like just rush, 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 like we're not living. And then we all had to like
Yes.
stop. And that was like very scary for a lot of people. Like, what do you mean? Like stay home and like not be doing 10,000 things? Like, how do I do this? And
Mhm.
that's like, part of why we've seen so many people really struggle with mental health. Like when you have a minute to finally sit down and not be distracted by running away from your life, you start seeing like,
Yeah.
oh my God, like this is what's happening. And like
Yeah.
this is neglecting, and this is who I was neglecting. And, so people were saying also like, so many people getting divorced from this and whatever. And I'm saying like, they're not getting divorced because of like being locked with their spouse. There were issues that were there pre-COVID. And when you finally have to stop for a minute and really like, you can't run away anymore from your problems, like you have to start looking at them. And for some people, it wasn't fixable or whatever it was. Other people, they were able to finally take a minute and have a virtual session with a therapist and work on things. But I think that we have to,
Yes.
kind of acknowledge that also, that like, yeah, some of us were leading lives before this that were like just so insane. And so now if we have kind of like a new lease on life of like, you know what, like now my lifestyle is just different because of what I've had to do because of not being able to go to the gym or whatever it is, my work, how it works now, we can embrace that, you know?
Yes, the hard pause has really created space for things to surface for people, 100%. I have started with a bunch of new clients in this COVID period. And when you ask kind of what's bringing you in, it's like things that I thought weren't bothering me are all of a sudden coming up again. And I think
Yeah.
that's so on point. But I also think that the time to slow down has also impacted us thinking about boundaries in our own relationships, right? Really taking a look at different friendships and in trauma work, it's kind of like you look at that version and you look at the evolving version, and you're so different. So people that may have fit that version of you at that point, right? That pre-pandemic life, because it really is a different chapter in our book. I feel that sincerely, that you've reemerged different. So you value and you respect boundaries, I think, in a very different way. That you've taken a minute to really evaluate and reevaluate really your life and yourself. And you're also looking around at who's been there for me, right? Like what has support looked like? Who hasn't been there for me? Everyone's moved through difficult things, but really reemerging, taking a look also at your own personal boundaries. Who do I need better boundaries with, right? What is this? Getting to know this new version of you. So it's not just that you're oh, can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me? Okay. I was just saying that it's also about just reevaluating boundaries and friendships in your life.
Right. And that's a great point because that is something that I've also gotten questions about, not just in my question box, in general. Like whenever I get messages on Instagram, people are kind of like, well, what about my friends who like I didn't hear from all year and we didn't talk and they didn't check in on me and so that's actually something that I do want to talk about. I think it's so important because um I think we have to forgive a lot, right? And this is kind of where the boundaries will come into play. Like I think we know everyone was going through something again, even if you think, well, what? Like they had it easy, like nobody died and they were working from home and she still had her help the whole time. Like everybody was going through this like collective trauma and grief on every level again. And I think that people were just at capacity emotionally. Like they didn't have like the wherewithal to text or call or and if they were trying to if to FaceTime with parents who were alone or stay connected with people that they really needed to be connected to first and foremost, like they just didn't have the energy at the end of the day to reach out to more people. And I think we need to really think about like not holding things like on principle, like, well, you didn't call me all year, like where were you, just saying like, what, everybody had a hard year and like let me just go back into this as we like reemerge and come out of our caves and just like let's see where everyone's at. And yeah, friendships may have changed because we're all different, but then I can figure out like, okay, so who am I going to stay connected with? And and again, there will be more loss, and that's why I think we won't even know the full extent of the mental
Yeah.
health for a while. There will be more loss and more sadness and just long-term effects that we can't even fathom yet, that we won't even know. um, I think that's important too, to really try, to reconnect and to allow people to reconnect with you and to let down that guard of like, well, you didn't call me. Like, you know what, if you're connecting with me now, like, let's see where everybody's
Yeah.
at. Let's just kind of forgive and understand that everybody was going through a hard time. And there may be things that they never share with you about what they went through. And I don't think anybody owes any explanations. I think that's important too, to just kind of like forgive and understand that everyone was kind of just trying to like get by every day, no matter how simple their lives looked. Even if they were on Instagram all day storying, we really don't know what goes on in people's lives.
I think that is such an important part and an important piece because, first of all, mental health, mental illness is invisible, right? So somebody can look put together and they could look like they have their health and they're in carpool line or they're, Instagram is a whole nother story of how people show up in this space, but it's so invisible. So nobody knows what goes on in somebody's mind. So somebody could present a certain way, but what's going on in their mind, right? For a lot of people who have had anxiety and depression, this exacerbated, or OCD, right? The cleanliness, the germs, the avoidance, right? That gave in, that exacerbated a lot of pre-existing stuff for people. So
Yeah.
I agree with you about really taking a moment of compassion for others, for sure. And I think that's actually a good point too, because I think a trigger point is sometimes people can come on Instagram, right, and story for 3 seconds, and then your narrative of them is like, okay, they're totally fine. Why haven't they reached out to me? And that's like a mind game a little bit, right? It takes a minute because that's not really valid information, right? The way people kind of present themselves, or, I try to stay authentic, but the way people present themselves is not always really indicative of what's going on. So
Right.
I think it's that, I heard my supervisor once said this amazing line that she said that, when you see an accident, you would think, don't just do something, don't just stand there, do something, right? Don't just stand there, do something, call 911, you have to help, right? But mindfulness is the opposite. Mindfulness is don't just do something, stand there. Like really take a step back, really pull back and think about, okay, wait, hold on, what is going on right now? That when we take a step back, that's the most active part. I always say, like, when you bake challah, the most active part of baking challah is when you let it sit. I'm going on the tangent. But when you let it sit and it rises, right, that's the most active part when you make any type of bread. So when you take a step back, that's where the activity, that's where all the work is. So I think that's a really big point also when talking about friendships and re-entering friendships and friendships that you may have lost touch, you feel like they weren't there for you, is really taking a step back and even saying to them, being transparent and saying, I'm feeling distant from you this year. I
Yeah.
moved through a lot of tough stuff, and I'm curious to always stem from a place of curiosity. I always say in relationships of, I'm curious what it was like for you, because I'm feeling like I felt pretty disconnected. What was that like for you? When we stay curious, it rids us from a place of judgment.
Yeah. It's a great point. And I just one more thing that I thought we should touch on was, people were saying like, what about the kids? Like, what's going to be with the kids? And I mean, for you, Ari, like you work in a school, so you're seeing this all the time, and I see kids in my practice. So I want to hear from you, like, what do you think, or what are you seeing is happening?
Yes, yes. So I know I didn't mention that. I just realized I work at Manhattan Day School here in the city, with fourth through eighth graders. And it's interesting. It's interesting. We learn, right, that kids are very resilient, that sometimes parents, and I get calls from parents all the time, very valid, normal calls of concerns that they have about their children. Um, I think the hardest thing for kids is when they leave on quarantine, quite honestly, and they're isolated and their whole class is in school. I think that
Yeah,
that's really challenging. I actually was remote for a bit, and I just came back a few weeks ago, so I could totally understand that feeling of coming back remote and what's that like. But coming back and seeing the kids in person, kids are very resilient. It's kind of become, I hate to say this word, I'm kind of like sick of saying it, but it has become a new normal in a sense. It's kind of like, okay, don't forget your mask, you have to put it over your nose, and it's kind of become routine for them. And I
yeah,
think that I do feel like what's going to have to happen once the rules change a bit is there have to be very clear managed expectations, especially in the school system, for what is the expectation of kids and what is the expectation of the teachers and the parents. But I'd love to hear from you too, Angel. But my sense is that when kids know what's expected, they do very well, right? We know the way that just their brains are still developing. They need rule, they need structure, they need a framework. So my sense is that they really are resilient, and there's this kind of structure and routine that's been set up for them, that
yeah.
it seems to me it helps them really function and be okay.
Um, there's actually a great book. I'm just looking up. Yes, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. Do you know this book by Dr. Bruce Perry? It's amazing. It's
Oh,
basically a child psychiatrist, and he talks about like he treats children with trauma, severe trauma. Some of the stories are super disturbing, so if you're sensitive, it might not be the greatest book for you. But he talks about like it's called like what traumatized children can teach us about loss, love, and healing. And he actually talks a lot about resiliency. And he says, a lot of times people say kids are resilient, like as if it's just like a natural skill. And he actually says that what creates resiliency in kids is actually being loved and being supported and feeling safe and having parents or caregivers who are there to support them when they are going through a trauma, to hold them, to hug them, to reassure them, whatever it is. And so really that's how we can assure that our kids are going to be okay. Is like we've got to be okay, and we have to help them to know that it'll be okay, right? So it's not enough for us to just lean back on like, oh, I heard, therapists say kids are resilient. Yes, they are, as long as we're there to support them in their
Yes.
resilience.
He was
You know?
actually just on an amazing podcast with Oprah and Super Soul Sunday. They wrote a book
Yeah.
together.
Yes.
What happened?
What
It's
happens? What happened to you, Oprah's new book? Oh, there you are. Yes.
I'm sorry, I keep going in and out. Anyway, he was talking about that um, that the biology of the child's brain is shaped based on the trauma that they've endured and the trauma they've been through. So the trauma responses, again, this is a whole other talk, but their trauma responses is based on trauma that they've moved through. So I love what you're saying, because it sounds like the safe adults in their lives are really the corrective, reassuring, the ground that. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened.
Hear you. But
What was
anyway,
that?
he says it's really up for our kids that determines like what happened. And we know that like there's no one traumatic event. It's really like what it means to that person. So what can be traumatic for one person, another person can endure the same thing and be okay. So it's really a matter of like, did you feel safe? Like what was happening? And we know really like it's a lot of the time it's the response afterwards that matters, and like how you overcome what you've gone through. So I think in terms of our kids, but even in terms of ourselves, showing up for ourselves, reassuring ourselves, being compassionate to ourselves, being kind to ourselves, and giving ourselves that pep talk of like, you know what, like Rachel, you can do this. And we know also that using that third person voice is a lot more effective in terms of like helping us ground ourselves and reassure ourselves more than I can do this, saying, Rachel, you can do this, right? We kind of step outside of ourselves. That's really important for getting through those tough
Yes,
times, each of those milestones of,
yes.
first day back at work, first wedding, first weekend bar mitzvah, first, whatever engagement party, first big family function, just really that compassion, that kindness, and encouragement.
And I think also, just on the children background for a second, with children, I think for parents and for teachers and anyone that works with children, it's so important to be in touch with your own kind of like emotional temperature, because they're models for how you navigate conflict and chaos. So I remember the beginning of the pandemic, I was speaking a lot about this, the importance of checking in with yourself, because that's such a big piece of it, if you're having a moment or you've heard disturbing news, as we move through this, what is your, it's kind of like habit changing, what is your response? And just children are constantly watching.
Yeah.
So the compassion with self, the checking in with self, I think that that's really how we move through this in a really healthy, in an emotionally healthy way, because there's also a big piece of, toxic positivity of like, it's all good. Like, it's actually not all good, right? Like, you could be healthy and you could still have your job. And like, there's such, like, get rid of the word but, because but negates both truths. And it's been really hard, so when we run to this place of it's all good, we're just kind of like pushing down like the authenticity and the truth of what you're feeling. So like really to create space for both, right? Like, I'm feeling nervous to go out and I'm excited. Like, I'm excited to get to know this new me, and I'm freaking out because like I don't think I have social skills, but it's holding both at the same time is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's another important point that you're bringing up that maybe we can just like end with is just that whole so of like if you've been okay, um and like meaning you didn't have a hard year, I think also that's important not to like guilt yourself. Well, like I know that other people had it really hard, and like how can I, you know be upset about what I'm going through because like I didn't really have a hard year. And like I think it's Rachel Herkman always says it's not like the Nebuch Olympics. You know, it's not the misery Olympics. Like she says the Nebuch Olympics. I always steal that from her. But it's not the misery Olympics. Like who had a harder year? Like you don't, Rachel, you don't have a real reason to be anxious and nervous about this. Like nothing terrible happened to you. It's not a competition. Like your sadness, your trauma, your fears, your grief, it's real and it doesn't need to be compared to other people. And yes, other people have suffered a lot and it doesn't take away, though, from the fact that you've also had a hard time. And again, I think it's important to validate that. Validating that doesn't mean that like other people didn't have it worse. They likely did,
Well, I
you
think
know?
that's a part of moving through different stages of grief. That's bargaining, right? When you're minimizing what your experience has been and saying someone else had it harder, that's just a way for your psyche to wrap around what the heck just happened to our world and our lives. So that's such an important part is to, when you minimize, just know that that's a defense mechanism of trying to really help you be present because it's sometimes it's just too much, but definitely to not minimize. Yeah.
Yeah. We all have real problems. They're all valid. And I think that's important to, show yourself that compassion and validate. And then we know that that way we can move through it, right? We have to feel it, we have to deal with it, and that way we can heal from it.
I always say feel hard, hurt hard, heal hard, right? Like to get to heal hard, you have to feel hard. Feeling makes you hurt hard, and then eventually you heal, but you can't pass through. You really have to experience it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank
I'm
you for
so
this.
glad we did this. I'm so, so glad. I hope everybody enjoyed. Someone asked, I think we'll be saved, right, Rachel? I
Yeah,
see someone asked her.
I'm gonna save it. But thank you so much. And if, everyone, please, go check out Ariella's page. She has amazing content and she's a fantastic clinician and an amazing person, obviously. And I will save this on my IGTV and then I'll send it to you also, Ariella, that you can send it on your page as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Rachel.
you. Good night.
Have a good night.